First of all, thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to be part of this. This, as you'll no doubt remember, is part of our strategic plan action team. In the context of that strategic plan, whose goal it is to for all students to have a personalized learning plan so that they become college and career ready, and that they develop the personal skills to be successful in life. This is Action Plan 1, Step 1.2, create a framework, including an intentional feedback loop to support personalized learning from pre-K through grade 12. So as I was looking at that, there are really three components that are particularly important that we need to consider. One of them is the concept of a framework, and we talked at some length last time about what that is. There's the concept of feedback, and there's the concept of personalized learning. So those three things, whatever we come up with in the end, needs to address those three things. It needs to be a framework, address personalized learning, and intentional feedback loop. So what I'd like to accomplish tonight, we're going to review some of the work that's been done and look at the Jamboards. There's some models that people have been working on, and if you've done that, thank you. And if you have been thinking about it, thank you as well. We're also going to break into some smaller groups so that we can have some more in-depth discussion with more people involved in that discussion. And then we're going to come back together and talk about what those models have in common, what we would like to do. So I'm going to share my screen and hold on. Get to the right thing. Okay. Hopefully you're able to see that. There are three models that have been proposed. And what I'd like to do is have the person who put it on there address what they were thinking and talk a little bit about it. And then we're going to move to the next one. So this first model is one that I proposed. I'll confess that when we're starting to do this, so actually when we met last time, the models I showed you were really academics. It did not provide a lot of context for feedback, and there wasn't a lot there about personalized learning. And so that was a challenge. What this model tried to do then was to incorporate all of those components. And as I look at it, it looks kind of like a tank moving forward. So you've got the wheels here, you're moving forward, and you have a personalized path. And you're making progress. To make that progress, you need instruction that teachers are providing, and you need feedback from families, and the students are the piece that holds it all together. As you look at the little comments, again, there needs to be more information about feedback and how that works and how gradual release. That was another question that came up. Other comments here about considerations. How would we communicate the shifts? What would engagement look like? What language? What does the language we're using make sense? Articulate how this will be a lasting shift that will be fundamental and have long-term positive impact rather than just a fleeting flavor of the month. So good questions. Those are things that would need to be considered. And then over here, I'm not sure whose comment that was, but talking about learning mastery, I'm assuming that that's representing what that path might mean. So that's the first one. Second model, Krista, I believe you were the one who originally put this on. Can you talk a little bit about what your thought process was?
Yeah, sure. So I too have to admit, so I went back after our meeting last time, and just was trying to capture some of the thoughts and thinking that everybody provided, and trying to just wrap my mind around what this might look like. And so I kind of saw it as the three parts again, but what I saw mostly was the fact that one, teachers in that gear kind of have to get the process going. So once they get that process going, and that process includes all the teacher things that we would want to have happen, such as being very clear on what it is we want students to be able to learn, and what it is we want students to how we're going to know that they've learned it. So being very clear on our standards, being very clear on our targets, and kind of answering those 4 questions of a team that works together to determine those. And then if we're crystal clear as teachers with those concepts and those things, we share those learning targets with the students, and then start to set goals with students around our proficiency scales. And then that's kind of gets the student going. And moving into the students, then the student has to know the learning target. They have to be able to help set those goals together with the teacher and their parents as well at that point. And then that gear kind of gets that belt going to then get the parents included in reporting, students self-reporting their learning to parents. And then again, once that belt is moving and the gears are going, then parents are aware of the learning target. They receive the progress through students reporting their learning, through the teacher being clear about the targets, and then kind of engaging in that conversation. So that's kind of where my thinking was. Looking at jumping forward to the next model, I definitely, I think, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Before you do that, you mentioned proficiency scales. I just want to show a sample of what that is in case you're not familiar with it. If you're not an employee, you very well may not be at this point. So proficiency scales attempt to operationally define what the priority standards are. We've identified priorities at each grade level in each content area, 8 of them. So I pulled up one from 2nd grade English language arts. This one happens to be a writing, which is why it's a W here. 2nd grade, standard 2. You've got the standard at the top in the blue box. And the idea is that this is a continuum of learning, and that students will progress as they learn more and more. They move up the scale. Level 3 is basically a restatement of the standard, or it's a breakdown of the standard and into its component parts. So if you're meeting that, that's great. But if you're not, level 2 are the areas that you may be working on or maybe need work on in order to get to level 3. Level 4 would be beyond the standard, beyond what you would need to be considered proficient. So I just wanted to give you that as an example. Krista, is there anything you would add to that explanation?
No, I think that was, you definitely described what those proficiency scales are there for.
Okay, very good. Now back to our discussion.
Yeah, so I guess then, so as I kind of thought about it and looked at it, and then moving forward to the next example, I see my thinking was more on that system thinking as far as overall big system, but then I do think that there is that need now for something more specific feedback for students as far as a framework for that. So I see that framework that was shared previously as kind of your system level, and now we're getting into the more fine-tuned sand grain of student level framework.
So with that introduction and transition, Christopher, I believe you were the one who put this up. What would you like to share?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks for kind of setting up the virtual space for us to put these ideas out there. I'm glad we were able to do it.
Yeah, me too.
I think the part that I tried to put together in this visual is thinking about our conversation last month about, how can we take these large ideas and concepts and really operationalize them as some sort of feedback loop. And also knowing that if we can take teacher speak as much out of it as possible, what can we do to provide this kind of feedback so that parents, students, and teachers are all speaking the same language. And one of the things that I kept thinking about, and I'm thinking back to my own kids' parent-teacher conferences from last week, it's, there's always a lot of information about, what's being done in the classroom and performance in the classroom, but there's often times not as much talking about skills and those academic skills. I was looking also, Dr. Dennis, to the portrait of a graduate that you sent along a few weeks ago. And I'll be honest, I mean, I was a high school social studies teacher, and I can guarantee you that kids walked out of my class and maybe 2 years later forgot all the content that we taught. But for me, it was important that they walked away with skills. And so I was thinking in the lines of critical thinking when I made this. And, what does this mean? Well, explaining issues, identifying evidence, formulating a position, reaching conclusions and sharing those conclusions. And if I were in a parent-teacher conference, how powerful could it be for me to provide this sort of graphic or something like it? I can tell you, we can achieve something that does the same thing with mastery learning inside of Canvas. We actually already have a tool that's really amazing for this. But my point was, we've got lots of different skills. Even the state has developed in their Navigating Change document to help teachers and schools in the pandemic isolate the small learning targets and goals for each level. We have those things. Say hi to my 4-year-old back there. He's making a cameo. And so from my perspective, it was how can we communicate skills to our parents, students, and families in a more effective way.
Okay. Thank you. That's a helpful explanation. And when I first looked at this, it took me a little while to process. So that really helps clarify for me what you were going for. Okay. So those are the three sort of foundational beginning points for a conversation that we can use as a jumping off point. I also sent to you a document. I believe I sent it yesterday. It's a rubric, and I've got it here on the screen. And it's not a great rubric, but I tried to take the three components we were just talking about: framework, the intentional feedback loop, and personalized learning, and put some structure to that, or some meaning to that, some definition to it. And so for each of the components, I've listed several criteria and what a rubric might look like, from level 1, where it's really not evident at all, to a level 4, which would be very high levels of implementation. So for the framework, these are things we talked about last week, but is it clear and easy to understand? One of the things a framework should do, according to Marzano, was to provide a common language, something that we could share among the staff and students and parents. Does it allow a data-driven approach? Can we monitor our progress? Is it a tool that will facilitate teacher collaboration? And would it work across content areas? One of the things that when the examples I shared last time were interesting examples, but they tended to be more content specific. So something a little more universal. In terms of an intentional feedback loop, there are three audiences for the feedback. Obviously, students are probably the primary audience, because it's their learning that is our concern, but also in finding a way to develop a model that addresses all of those audiences is difficult. And as I searched for examples out there, I didn't find them. So what we're doing is unique, and I think that's pretty neat. It also hopefully will target priority standards and the proficiency scales, which I just shared an example of. Formative assessment, in other words, not just paper and pencil, high stakes testing, but that monitoring of progress along the way. And then identifying next steps in terms of instruction. And then component 3 was personalized learning. All of these came basically out of the state's definition and now our definition. So the student being at the center of instruction, relationships and their importance to personalizing learning, equity and opportunity for choice in the manner of learning, evidence-based instructional modes, students being active in creating their own plan and developing their own pathways for learning, facilitating competencies both for interpersonal, and also for cognitive competencies, and then really having students own their learning. So those were the components or the criteria I came up with to support those. Here's what I would like to do. I'm going to, and you should all have a copy of that. Hopefully, if you don't have it in front of you, you can pull up from your email. What I'd like to do is to break into small groups for this part. Ideally, we'd be able to do this in person, but in order to really get at the level of conversation that I would like to get and to have as many people as possible participate in this, I'm going to break you into some small groups here on WebEx. So when I move you to your group will be there and you'll be able to interact with them. What I would like for you to do is, with this rubric in mind that we just looked at, look at the 3 models in more depth, and then talk about how well do they fit this rubric? Do they meet our needs? And if there's one that does, great. If not, what can we do to either create something new or to tweak one of the models that we have to better represent these 3 areas? What I then would like for you to do is to take whatever you decide, whatever you come up with, and add to the Jamboard. Just create another one on the end. And then when we come back, I'm going to ask you to share your group's thinking for how we can improve on the models that we have to better address these 3 areas. So does that make sense? I think I'm seeing nods. Okay, this will take a moment, but I'm going to break you into groups. I'm going to try to get a nice mix of staff and non-staff in these. So this will take a minute to do. I'm going to ask everybody to come back, let's say at 4:45, so 25 minutes. Hopefully that will give you time to have that conversation and really get some depth in the conversation about how we can go. So this will take a moment, so please bear with me, and I will get you into some groups. Was able to pop in and out of your meetings a few times, so very interesting conversations. Let's start with the group that John and Krista and Christopher, that group. Somebody tell us about what you talked about, and did you reach any conclusions?
Leah, you want to share?
I was hoping you were going to share. Well, honestly, I felt like it was like Jeopardy, and we were like, da-da, because there was like, I felt like there was a timer. But I think that we had a lot of really great discussion. We talked about the needs for what is on, the different slides or frames, as you want to call them. But we did say that we saw frame 3 as kind of overall kind of fitting into maybe a part of the frame 2. We talked about the idea of seeing the gears with the loop being with the students and the parents having that loop for them to be a unit, that was kind of important too, because hopefully that's happening, but who knows? It's just great to have that as a visual. And then as we were talking about different things and thinking, as Krista liked to say, the 30,000 foot view versus the bird's eye view versus the down on the ground view in the trenches. I kind of shared also what a honeycomb view would look like, because I know that that's a big part of framework development too, is having kind of that honeycomb. So we didn't really come to a consensus. We liked both. We thought that they fit together, but obviously things need to be tweaked. And we're not sure what we want it to visually look like.
Okay. How about the other group? Brian, Jared, Steve, Jenny?
I could share out a little bit. We kind of talked about, I think, maybe some of the same kind of conversations that first group had. But I think what we would like to see is maybe more of where this particular chunk of the plan fits into the overall plan. And so like we talked about, like the last group kind of defined or adopted the definition for individualized learning. And so what we were thinking of is how would a framework fit individualized learning at every level? And because obviously individualized learning at elementary, middle school, high school is going to be different. And so how can one framework kind of fit that all in? And so I think our conversation kind of led to more of, whereas in high school, you can take different in middle school, you can take different courses and kind of take different paths. In elementary, one of the things that I've seen and I've done when I was teaching was, you still kind of feel a little bit tied to, okay, today's lesson 1, tomorrow's lesson 2, lesson 3, whereas an individualized plan may not be so much students doing, Genius Hour type projects where they get to pick the learning, not that they can't do that, but that it might be more making sure they hit those priority standards and really giving teachers support that they can feel that it's okay to, if you have a priority standard that a student hasn't mastered or hasn't even hit proficiency, that they can spend a few days working with the student on that as opposed to necessarily moving on with that student. So that student may still be focusing on, that first standard, whereas other people may be moving on to standards that are in front of that, but are not priority standards. So I think right now we're still doing a lot of, today's day 1, so we do day 1. Tomorrow's day 2. No matter what happened day 1, we're going to do day 2. And so giving a little bit more freedom in that realm to make it more individualized, but not so much that the kids are choosing, but just that they can, we can make sure that they understand the data. I think that's what maybe Steve said, that, making sure that the kids really understand, what okay, here's your DIBEL score, but what does that mean for you? Here's your MAP score. What does that mean for you? And making sure that data is really clear for the students, because I think, individualized teaching for mastery. Monitor the chat here too. But it's the individualized part may almost be more, or not more, but whereas in high school, I feel like it's more the student can have their individualized, this is kind of my pathway. Where in elementary school, the individualized part may be, is to Leah's point, more for the teacher to make sure that all the students are on their own plan to achieve that mastery. And we didn't come up with a framework. we looked at the ones that were there. We liked them all. We kind of, I think a few of us liked the last one just because it but I think we also kind of looked at the first one as being more simplistic. And so I think that was a good place to start. And we did have a good discussion, not to totally ramble on, but about the proficiency scales. And so, I think we had heard, maybe 21, 22 or 22, 23, the grade card was going to switch over. And I think that as part of the feedback loop, whenever that happens, like that has to be the last step and not the first step. It can't be like, hey, teachers are coming back that year and you're going to start using proficiency scales. And, I know that those are already out there that teachers can use those, but that needs to be the last step. So when we introduce it to parents, it's something that we feel really comfortable with being able to explain and go into depth. And so it's not just, any chart can look good, but it's more what we do with it. So
That's certainly true. It doesn't matter what you put on paper if it doesn't change anything about the classroom or the school. Both groups mentioned number 3. What did you like about that? What did you like about it?
I think that it's the piece that is very student driven and provides that picture of where a student is in relation to some kind of skill or standard or outcome that we're looking for students. So I think that's the nice piece of it. It's very detailed in that piece, very practical for a teacher use.
So,
I think
go
it's
ahead.
useful because it provides clarity. When it has details, but it provides clarity. Whether it's, there's other things or adjustments to be made, could be a conversation, but you're able to look at this from a teacher, a student, or a parent and understand what the components are and see where the student is in relation to each of those components in relation to mastery. So the clarity, I think, is a major advantage of this one.
John, that's real similar to what I was going to say. The idea that a parent could look at it and find meaning, a student could, or a teacher, and any of those people could look at it and say, here's where I'm strong, here's where I need some work. So,
And if I might add, as the person who put that on there, I think the piece that isn't on there, because you can't put it on the visual, is it drives the conversation forward in terms of progress and personalizing. Like if this fake student that I put on here is having some real trouble with formulating a position. They can explain the issues and they can identify evidence, but then they need some help in terms of formulating a position. We can now, as a teacher, parent, and student team, or as a PLC, or whatever, we can have a conversation about what do we need to do to drill down for the next few weeks with this particular student, or you as a student, what can you do to drill down on formulating a position? I had a list of other examples, but you might have in an ELA class summarization and analysis. And here's where you are in terms of summarization and analysis. What can we do over the next couple of weeks before we visit this again to get you closer to that target and maybe get right in that target? To me, you can't put that on a visual. It's the conversation, but it's a very specific conversation around a skill. And we can wrap a lot of content inside of that.
I will say from an elementary perspective, and just thinking about language and stuff, I'd say that this secondary friendly than elementary, as I'm trying to think about like each of the components and how that would apply to our littlest of littles. I think that we also have to keep in mind that we may have to have a little bit different visual or language when we're thinking about primary versus secondary, which is what my group kind of talked about, keeping it fairly generic where it can apply across the board. And then if we need to, breaking out and then getting very specific with what that looks like in secondary and what that looks like in primary.
so what would you say, Jenny, is what would make it more elementary friendly?
Oh, well, I'm thinking it for sure K through 3, if not K4. And again, some of the verbiage and the language, I think would be hard for students to wrap their brains around.
You're talking about the words on the edge, conclusions, show your effects of that language?
Yeah, I mean, some of it I think we could take and put into kid-friendly terms. I just think as a teacher, like when I look at this, and I taught kindergarten and first grade for the majority of my classroom teaching career, it's almost a little overwhelming, the vocab that is there, and thinking about, okay, now when I'm working with a little, how, if we could just make it a little more elementary friendly in terms of thinking, because like with my kindergarten student, yeah, we could set a goal, and we did that, and we talked about what that meant and where we wanted to go as far as like counting, skip counting, letter ID, all of that, very basic, and they can still take ownership of that. I don't think you get to the depth of some of these items. because you're setting that foundation to get them to understand taking ownership and what it looks like to understand where you're at in that path.
And it's more direct language specific to the foundational skills, I think, in the earlier years.
I guess I just assumed that it would, like, the process of marking my spot on a target, let's say, if that's what it is, that process is the same, but whatever skill or target or standard I'm working towards, that's the language that's going to be around the target.
And
Kind of, maybe my assumption, that could be, I could be off.
in a student-friendly language, is that what you're talking about?
And in a grade, I mean, like an outcome standards language, as well, as far as kindergarten outcomes are these. So my target is going to look like this for kinder. It's still a target. I'm still marking, basic, proficient, master, whatever my language is. But my goal is around whatever foundational skills I'm working on in kindergarten.
Okay, so clarity, is this something that we would then be expecting people to utilize, or is this, I guess I'm confused of what this visual, like, what is our intentions with this visual?
We're not at the point where we're talking yet about, I've forgotten even what number it is in the strategic plan, but about changing the way that we provide grades or feedback. But as someone alluded to earlier, it is in here. So I think that's a fair question. But as a model for how students, teachers, and parents can collectively understand where a student's progress is and where their needs are, I like the visual. I don't know that I answered your question, but
I think too, if I may, one of the things I was thinking is our task to create a visual that conceptualizes what we're talking about, which I think all of those do. 3 does well, or are we supposed to create a visual that defines the system response for individualized learning for kids? Does that make sense? So it's almost like are we creating like a, I don't know, like an RTI diagram, if you will, on what those things look like?
I think we're creating a systemic piece that could be applied in a more granular way, I believe. Does that make sense?
That's why I kind of was wondering too, like, I feel like, again, my view was the systemic, and then dropping the model 3 into the system is kind of where his fits. So the system these are the things that have to happen to be able to have that target, that goal setting, that feedback, and we drop that into, because that, to me, his is the more fine-grained component, but I could.
Right. That's really what I was trying to say. That you said it more clearly than I did.
And I might add too, Jenny, I think you're exactly right. When I used critical thinking and wrote that piece, I was literally taking it from a rubric that I used in my senior government class. So like, yes, you're spot on. But I will say, like, I just pulled up the ASDE's Navigating Change document that the State Department of Education team of teachers put together. And they have a lot of these things, these competencies, these skills already identified. I'm looking at the spreadsheet, which is pre-K through 2nd grade, the competencies for ELA. So if I were building the target, the target wouldn't be, the graphic wouldn't be critical thinking. It would be pre-K through 2nd grade, pre-K ELA. And then the parts of the pie, writing, speaking, and listening, and reading. The state already, the state team had said, here's some identified skills and competencies that are really important in a pre-K through second grade system. And they're good. They're teacher language, but they're good inside of those pieces of the pie. So if I'm a teacher having this conversation with a kid and a parent, we're going to talk about writing, speaking and listening, and reading. And then I'm going to be able to communicate where that kid falls within that. That makes sense, right? And so like they have these for all the different grade bands and all the different content areas. Yes, that's why that document is 1,000+ pages. But like that's where I was thinking that something like this could be used throughout really any grade level. And there's lots of resources out there that we don't have to reinvent the words and the ideas that are in there.
Well, I was even thinking more local than that. You're right, the state has developed some competencies. We have priority standards at every grade level, and we have our proficiency scales. At the elementary level, they're ready to go, and secondary level, they're in development. You could make that target, instead of 5 levels, make it 4 and match the proficiency scales, plug in our priority standards, and you'd be pretty close.
I would agree, absolutely.
Well, and along those lines, would it be too much? And I'm thinking particularly like at that K through 3 level. So let's say you did that and you cut it to the 4 and but instead of having different priority standards in each section, what if you had one of these for each proficiency scale? And so instead of each section being a different star, each section was, I can, and then whatever would be at level 1. And so you would move, you see what I'm saying? So you're not looking at a bunch of information. As a kid, you'd be looking at kind of which quadrant I'm in, so to speak.
I might have to see it visually, but I think I understand what you're saying.
Well, like for example, what's on there right now, if I'm correct, without knowing the high school standards. So Christopher, I think that would be like multiple standards on one, right? So I'm thinking more at the elementary level. At the elementary level, you could have your 4 sections. I'm kind of spitballing this, but 4 sections. And so instead of having 4 different stars, you have 1 star, and this is your proficiency scale. And so the kid would be moving, instead of moving inward, I guess I'm trying to think. I don't know how this would work.
You're like around a clock or
yeah, it'd be like you're trying to get to a finish line, so to speak. Although and we did talk about that in our group, kind of making sure that, you're not all going to reach level 4, and that's okay.
Right.
That'll be a mind shift for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Even as I say that now, I'm thinking that maybe that's not the best idea, because then a kid's going to complete the circle, and if you're not consistently above grade level, it'd be really hard to do that. So
right.
Maybe that'd be a challenge.
I'm also going to be straight up honest that, while we have in many of our courses identified priority standards, and I'm speaking from the secondary level.
Right.
While we have identified those, we are, at least in my building, farther away than we should be from actually implementing priority standards. And so while that's a shift for our students and our parents, I'm going to be honest, and that would be still a very big shift for our teachers at the secondary level. That's all I can speak to. And I think, so I also want to be really super mindful of that, because we still fight the battle at the secondary level in hybrid and remote learning, saying these are still really, really important things. Identify those. The expectation is that you've identified those and that you're implementing them, but then somebody turns around and says, but they're not going to learn everything, so you have to still teach everything. I've got 186 standards that the IB program or that something gives me, so I got to do it. So we still have a lot of mind shifting to work on secondary level, in my opinion.
And it's even made more difficult by our current circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. that's where I think like which comes first, right? That's the situation. That's the question I'm asking. You know, which comes first? Does the model come first and say, all right, this is how all of this is going to fit into that model. Now let's jump into the model and put it into action, or is it let's do some cultural shifting around pedagogy and teaching and learning, and then put the model in place? Like I sit in the middle of that wondering.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably a bigger question than we can answer in our meeting today. Because our goal is still the same. We have to come up with the model. And then we'll have to figure out how to do it at some future date. Other thoughts about conversations today, or kind of the direction our conversation's headed since we've come back together?
I guess this is kind of a question, so I think I thought I was a little more clear, and now I think I'm a little less clear, which may be okay. But so, and I think Steve was kind of asking this. So, what we're looking at when we look at like Model 3, or I guess Jamboard 3 there. So that's more the model for how we would have that conversation with students and kind of explain where they're at. And I do think that looks really good. But so is our framework going to be kind of more like 1 or 2, where it's like, this is, you start with a pre-assessment, you move into communicate, like are we going to kind of put in like, this is where you should be communicating with the students, this is where you might communicate with the parent? Is it kind of the full feedback loop, or because this is more kind of feedback like on a standard or a set of standards, and it doesn't really include the parents? It's how you can present it to the parents, but are we kind of supposed to be thinking of a framework that's more, these are the good stopping points where, along the PLC process, where you could communicate with parents, current progress, what needs to be done, that sort of thing, or communicate with students for that matter?
It's a great question. I'm interested in your thoughts.
I'm right there with Brian. I feel like visuals are okay, but that we're going to need probably more steps and items, and whether it's protocols or suggestions, being more specific and maybe tight about some of these items and what it looks like at the elementary, what it looks like at secondary. I feel like even thinking about the feedback loop in the classroom, that there's just going to be a lot of education all around that we need to do and we need to plan for, as far as thinking about education for our parents, education for our teachers, and then how teachers impact students, and kind of form that loop and that circle. I feel like we can't just have like a visual like Jamboard 3 and expect that to be clear enough for teachers, parents, and students of what is expected.
So that would need to be in the context of something, a bigger model.
Yeah, and I don't know how we want that to look, and if it's written out. I know in other places in the strategic plan where they have like the action item and kind of how that, when that's going to be carried out by, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if we need to go more that route with some of these items and looking at bigger things that we want in place system-wide. I just think there needs to be more clarity in that regard.
Yeah, and Jenny, so I totally agree with you, and I think that, and again, I know we're part of a bigger plan, and so I'm hoping that someone, as we move from step to step, hopefully there are people who are, at a higher pay grade than us, right, looking at all these different pieces and then figuring out how that's going to fit into one cogent plan. And so I think that with what you're saying, so I think with, if we say, we can throw it up on a website and say this is the model, and there's 50 pictures that look just like this probably on our website that teachers never look at and I've never seen, and but I think that when we talk about all the different parts of the process, I think it's easier for teachers and it's more digestible if we kind of say, like, this is our overall instructional framework. And so we start, and that would include the PLC process, that would include communicating those individual plans. And so I think it's smart because we're focusing on one little piece of it, but it has to fit as one part of a plan. Otherwise it just feels, because I have teachers who, even now, it's hard for them to wrap their head around, okay, I've got these proficiency scales and these common assessments, and you want us to do PLC. And I'm thinking, hey guys, this is all one process. Like, don't think about it as 50 different things you're doing. Let's look at it as one process. And I don't think that we're totally there yet, which is fine. You know, it's some of that is new or fairly new. But I think if teachers can see, you know, almost like the flow chart for the whole picture, like, and maybe it's different for elementary and upper grades as well, but you know, like this is kind of the flow of how we start our instruction, how we pre-assess, what we do in the PLC process, how we communicate that data to students and to parents, how we go back and reteach, and this is all part of the whole flow. Where you know, this is what we do on the common assessment. This is how proficiency scales fit in. So as a teacher, you know, and I'm not for taking autonomy away from teachers, so don't misunderstand me. But as a teacher, I think it would be nice to say like, hey, in Shawnee Mission, this is what we do. This is how we teach. Now you have freedom and creativity as part of that, but as part of our process in general, we start with pre-assessment. This is how we communicate. This is where we end up. And if we're not where we want to be, this is how we go back and reteach and kind of fit that into our day. So I think seeing that as part of a bigger plan makes more sense to me as opposed to a lot of little parts, because I think that's when we can kind of lose the trees to the forest or whatever.
Dr. Dennis, I appreciated you sending out that rubric, and I'd like to see some more time spent looking at the rubric, and then once we've got more solidification with that and understanding, move toward then how is that reflected in the framework, and use that rubric as the function for designing the framework to ensure that we have all of the elements that we want to have represented in that framework.
I can certainly, and I agree. The rubric I sent is, it's a first draft, and it's a start point. I can put that out on a Google Doc so you can see it and suggest some changes to it to improve it as well. I don't disagree at all. I think it's that needs to be the foundation of how we make decisions moving forward.
So speaking of moving forward, just to begin, maybe not begin, but to use the end of like, what's the next group that we hand this off to? You know, I was trying to get to that chart, and I don't know if I just didn't have access to it or how to get to it. But what is the 1.1.3?
1.1.3 is not really direct. It's about career and technical ed, but 1.1.4 talks about developing ongoing job-embedded professional learning that supports personalized learning.
Okay.
So
it sounds like we're that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. Action Plan 2 deals with having relevant learning experiences, so research-based best practice, identifying partnerships in the community. It's more about collaboration between different groups.
Okay.
Action Plan 3, we are identifying essential competencies, which is really what that's already in place, the priority standards, that's been done. Revising curriculum, implementing research-based instructional strategies, identify appropriate structures for feedback. So some of the things we're talking about start to come into place here. Here's where aligning grading practices comes into play.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
How would so you said feedback on that last part in 3, how would that be different than what we're doing?
Let me see. Identify appropriate methods and structures for feedback to determine levels of proficiency. I see it looks to me like the same.
It's
same issue. So there's certainly overlap in this plan. So whatever we develop, they don't start till 2021. that action plan 3 item. So we would hand off to them whatever we came up with. But I think we proceed on the path we're on.
Yeah.
I think it fits within our mandate.
Do you think it would be a good idea? You know, the rubric's got a lot of key components in there, like data and growth and feedback,
Right.
to really identify the key components of our framework. So we have those set, and then look at, okay, well, where are there going to be big differences between primary or even within primary and within secondary, and what are we going to have to break apart and get more specific? And, you know, where does the graph from Jamboard 3 fit in? And, you know, I think where I'm struggling is I need those key pieces and how those are going to fit together, and then start looking at specifics and how to break those down and how it's going to be functional. You know, whether it's, you know, we've got feedback and, you know, we roll this out to all the schools. Here's the general framework. Well, in high school, these are your options to that we expect for monitoring growth or giving feedback to parents. And, you know, I feel like it's going to end up getting specific even down to each elementary school or school itself. But I feel like I need to hold on to the key concepts that are going to be our foundation, our building blocks for all of this.
So can you give me an example of a key component that you're talking about?
Like data. I assume we want this to be data driven. We want the decisions on on how decisions are being made, whether it's, you know, the growth of students or, looking at priority standards, all of that. We're going to have to base it. So I would say data is a key component. And, you know, how does that look? What data are teachers going to use? Or even, it can even be what data are we going to be discussing with parents and part of the feedback. But, you know, growth, how is that going to be measured, and personalization, and, just feedback within, you know, teacher to student feedback and parent feedback. And, you know, I feel like there's a lot of common things that we can at least put down that would be good building blocks, and then kind of see how those fit together, and then start looking at the differences between, you know, what's gonna be a part of our overall plan, and where do we need to start breaking apart and saying, okay, well, here's our K-3 plan. That's, you know, here's
what's universal needs to be
correct.
So if working on this and clarifying this, would that meet the needs of what you're talking about? Or are you talking about?
Well, yeah, I think looking at the rubric, there's a lot of those key components and those building blocks within here.
Mm-hmm.
And they may not all apply, you know, clear and easy to understand. Well, that's not going to be a foundation of our framework, but yes, we want it to be clear and easy to understand. So some of them don't apply, but they're, you know, just looking through them, I think there is a lot of good foundational blocks there.
Okay. That helps me understand what you're talking about. Okay. I feel like we've reached a point where we need to step back. At least my brain does. I will put this rubric out for you so you can start suggesting some where it could be modified or where it could be clarified. And let's do this. We've talked about using number 3, Jamboard number 3, as part of something larger. Start thinking about what that something larger might be while we're clarifying this too. So I understand this needs to be first, but be thinking about where that might fit in. I'm going to try to put together some ideas and put them out there for you. It's not going to be tomorrow, but hopefully before the winter break, I can get something out to you to start beating up, thinking about, improving, clarifying, based on our conversation. So I've taken some notes on what we've talked about here, and I'll try to put something together for you to react to, and that hopefully we can take another step forward. Sound good? All right. I think we'll call that a meeting then for today. Thank you very much for your time. What would you say about next meeting being after New Year's? Are you okay if we don't meet between now and the end of December? I think people are feeling pretty busy right now. So I will suggest some times when I send something out to you for after New Year's Day, back together and see where we are. All right. Let's end it there. Thank you very much for your time. I feel like we've taken some steps forward tonight. I feel a little more clarity about where we need to go with this. This is a big task. And so thanks a lot. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.